Good evening, friends. This is Dr. Vijay Kumar Chenamchetty, Webinar Coordinator of CCA. What a fantastic evening. Welcome you all on behalf of CCA and on behalf of our beloved President, Mr. N.H. Krishna, for this great academic event. Today will be a date to remember in the upcoming years of Indian pulmonology, as CCA's unique concept of mega web interaction with stalwarts in Indian pulmonology on various different interesting topics in the field of pulmonology. I would request each one of you viewing this webinar to shoot most complex clinical scenarios in our day-to-day practice so that the stalwarts who are discussing the cases and the persons will come back to you with interesting solutions and with a lot of evidence-based medicine practice. With this short introduction, I will hand over mic to our CCA's Chief Spokesperson, Dr. Atri Gangopajaya, to invite moderator and panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vijay. We are like two brothers from two different states. It's my privilege, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce our star-studded cast today. Just like the solar system revolves around the sun or Surya, the moderator for today is none other than Professor Surya Kant from Lucknow, King George Medical University. He has been or is the president of Maximum Chess Societies in India. Dr. Surya Kant shall be the moderator today evening. And our panelists, first we have who has served greater than a quarter century in India's defense, armed forces, navy, and currently working at Bombay as a pulmonologist at Bombay Hospital and the JJ Hospital. Dr. P.S. Thampi. Dr. Thampi will answer regarding asthma and allergy. Then we have a person who is an institution in himself, Dr. Subhakar Kandi, hailing from Kamineni Institute, Hyderabad. Currently in this lockdown, sir is in the United States and he is so kind enough to connect with us across time zones at a time that is uncomfortable for him. But the moment he got this invite, sir did not refuse. Dr. Subhakar will answer questions on tuberculosis. Then we shall come to Pune, Ruby Hall Clinic, a doctor who was behind our very successful 4th National CCI Con Pune, Dr. Mahavir Modi, will answer questions on COPD. Then we come to Chennai, one of the pioneers of lung transplantation in India, rapidly increasing the numbers of a new lease to life, none other than Dr. Apar Jindal, who will answer questions on interstitial lung disease and sleep disorders. Again, we shall come back to Mumbai. The Mumbai local train divides the city into east and west. People from east generally stay in the east, people from west generally stay in the west. But this is one doctor to consult whom people from east jump to the west, people from west jump to the east. Dr. Mehul Thakkar from Mumbai, he will answer questions on sleep disorders and vaccine. When we talk about women in pulmonary medicine, one of the first names that comes in current scenario is the woman power, Dr. Sonia Dalal. Very recently, prior to lockdown, she had organized a conference where all the faculty were women powers in pulmonary medicine. So Dr. Sonia Dalal from Gujarat will answer questions related to infectious diseases. I hand over the stage to our moderator, Professor Surya Kant now. And stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen, for a power-packed evening. Thank you.
Hello everybody, welcome to this evening program organized by CCI, and such a mega event has not been held in the past. Yeah, now we have Dr. Suryakant, who is the moderator for this evening. So I welcome Dr. Suryakant. Please, sir.
Thank you.
Welcome, sir.
Should I start? Okay. Great. So, good evening, friends. Welcome to this wonderful academic evening organized by Chess Council of India. And Chess Council of India, you know, it's a very vibrant, very young, I would say, but very energetic platform, I would say, rather than organization. Why I am saying this platform? Because this is the Corona period when we have turned more digital, but this Chess Council of India started its journey from digital platform only. It is started with the WhatsApp group. That was a news for me a few months back when I learned that Chess Council of India started with the smaller, so many WhatsApp groups. So I think Chess Council of India, the organizers of Chess Council of India, the founder of Chess Council of India, they were visionary enough, they were having foresight, and that's why they can presume that the era of digital is coming. For the last few months they are digital, but Chess Council of India is to begin with digital. Now if I compare the academic bodies of chess in this country, then probably first body of the chess fraternity was established around more than 60 years back. And when I compare this body to that 60 years old body and the 6 years old body, I found a great difference. I found a great, I would say, the comparator parameters. But I am not going to compare these associations, compare these bodies, but I would say that I have experienced the National College of Chess Physicians India, the oldest chess body in this country. I have also experienced the Indian Chess Society, one of the 40 years old body now. And luckily I have been the president of both societies. But for the last few months I have been exposed to the Chess Council of India, and this I found a very different kind of academic platform. It has got more than 3,000 young energetic chess physicians of this country on a common platform. So it is the largest number. Roughly membership of Indian Chess Society is around 3,000. Membership of National College of Chess Physicians India, it is roughly 2,000. But this has got more than 3,000 chess physicians working academically, expressing their views, sharing their skills, sharing their, of course, experiences on the same academic platform that is Chess Council of India. So with these opening remarks, I really congratulate to the founder of CCI, to the members of CCI, and of course, I welcome to all our topic masters of this evening. So we are here with, of course, Sonia Dalal, who will be giving her expert opinion on infectious diseases. Dr. Shubhakar Kandi, of course, he's in held up in the USA due to lockdown. So he's, of course, delivering his views and, of course, his thoughts from US. So it has become an international event because of him. Credit goes to Dr. Shubhakar. By virtue of Corona, he's in US, and that's why he has made this event as international. So he's a topic expert for the tuberculosis. And of course, Dr. Apar Jindal, a young, energetic boy I'm seeing for the last 3-4 years by virtue of his dynamic activities on interstitial lung disease. I have been in Chennai also is this. So Apar will be, of course, interacting on the interstitial lung disease. And of course, very energetic, very experienced, I would say, Dr. Tampi. So of course, not only this is the amalgamation of the civilian part as well as the of course, militant part. So that's a wonderful thing. So we have amalgamation of so many things here. So welcome Dr. Tampi also. So he will be giving his, of course, expert opinion on asthma. And then of course, Dr. Mehul Thakkar. Dr. Mehul Thakkar is from Mumbai. And of course, he will giving his opinion on sleep as well as on vaccine topic. And of course, none other than another Modi, the Mahavir Modi from Pune. So he will be giving his expert, of course, opinion on COPD. So with this, I start. If any expert is ready, then of course, I'll select the opening batsman, Dr. Shubhankar Kandi. Dr. Shubhankar Kandi, more and more questions you will be, because I have already around 40 questions in the list. So first question, as the opening batsman, Dr. Shubhankar Kandi is, and the question is that the question. First question, scroll the down. Scroll the down and you
before you ask the question.
Yeah. So the question coming to, actually, I have to scroll down because
CCI for giving me an opportunity to share some of my views on tuberculosis.
Okay. What is the utility of TrueNat test in tuberculosis?
I think that's a good question. All these days,
test.
molecular tests, we are doing Gene Expert Ultra, and LAMP. These are some of the molecular tests for the rapid diagnosis of tuberculosis. That is, most of them are DNA-based tests. All these are international, manufactured by a company called Sequoia, based in US. But with the Modi Prime Minister, the Make in India concept, India has also come up with some rapid genotypic testing that is called TrueNat test. The TrueNat test is this company is based at Goa. This is almost recently the WHO has given endorsement. It is on par. The results are on par. If you compare sensitivity and specificity of TrueNat with the CBNat, the almost equal. With the only difference between the TrueNat and the Gene Expert test is TrueNat is a chip-based test, whereas Gene Expert is a probe-based test. Both are molecular tests, both are genotypic tests, but the TrueNat is a chip-based test. And the difference between our traditional Gene Expert test, which we are using in the program, is a two-phase test. In the step 1, you diagnose TB is there or not. In the step 2, if the TB is there, you see for the rifampicin resistance. Unlike in Gene Expert, simultaneously you get the result for both for the MTB detection as well as rifampicin resistance. Chip-based, the TrueNat test will give in 1 hour that the TB is there. If TB is there, then the second step is the second hour you do.
Thank you, Dr. Kandi. Thank you, Dr. Shubhankar. Thank you, Dr.
And
Shubhankar.
one more, before I close, one more advantage of this is even 0.5 ml of specimen is enough, and you can do this even primary health centers also. That's a battery operated, and the need for AC. For Indian conditions, in the low income countries, the TrueNat test is a better alternative for Gene Expert.
Thank you, Dr. Shubhankar. In nutshell, I can say this is an indigenous test developed in India, very much feasible for the Indian population, as it can be done at very remote and periphery because it can be battery operated. Cost is very simple, very cheap. So I think ideally indigenous test very much feasible for the Indian population. Thank you, Dr. Shubhankar, as the opening batsman, for this wonderful answer. Now the second question coming to the vaccination. So I have to go for this vaccination purpose with Dr. Mehul. Dr. Mehul, the question for you, and the question for you is, vaccination in chronic obstructive airway diseases. Just brief, precise answer to your question.
In chronic obstructive airway diseases or
Yes.
like asthma or COPD, we
Yes.
deal with patients who come to us with recurrent infective and non-infective exacerbations. So vaccinations does help us to cut down on those cases. So what I prefer to do is give them a flu vaccine, and with the current quadrivalent vaccine, that will be the preferred modality of vaccination. Flu vaccination every year. And if you have the facility of vaccinating twice a year, then the strain changes, northern and the southern strain, so you can give it twice a year depending on the availability in your area. Also, vaccination against pneumococcal diseases is available as a conjugate vaccine, a 13-valent and a 23-valent. What I usually prefer to do is give 23-valent vaccinations every 5 years. Both the vaccines of flu and the pneumococcal are given intramuscularly. Preferably not on the same day, should be given at least 3 or 7 days apart. One other thing I would like to add is the 13-valent vaccine has been found to be safe in people above the age of 50 years. And once you give the 13-valent vaccine, it should be followed by a 23-valent vaccine at least a month later. So this would be the vaccination schedule that you give in such patients. And what I have found is even if it doesn't cut down on the flu episodes, at least the severity of the flu would be less in such patients. Hello.
Thank you, Dr. Mehul. Now, next question is to Dr. Mahavir Modi. Dr. Mahavir Modi, this question related with COPD, that asthma COPD overlap syndrome, when to suspect and what is the difference in management?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Srikanth. It's a burning issue. We see very commonly asthma COPD overlap syndrome in many of our patients. And I think the first and the foremost important thing while diagnosing an echo is when we have a clear history. So history is most important when you have a patient who has a history of, say, atopy in the past, or history of asthma for years together, seasonal exacerbations, recurrent exacerbations, history of allergic rhinitis along with this. And the PFT may show reversibility, may not show reversibility with 400 ml of FEV1 increase after giving bronchodilator. But these patients have basically a combination of asthma symptoms and the combination of COPD. So most of the times what I see in my practice is that these patients may not have typical variability on the spirometry, but history-wise they are more into asthma or allergic rhinitis or atopic kind of features. The management typically differs for these patients because many of the times they come to us at a late stage when we diagnose them as COPD. But this is one subset of COPD patients where the inhaled corticosteroids may still have a role, especially considering the history of atopy and eosinophilia in these patients. So phenotyping of these patients become very important, and many of the times they may be behaving more like non-smokers COPD, where they may present more with chronic bronchitis than the emphysema pattern. They may have fewer exacerbations as compared to your, they may have more exacerbations as compared to your regular COPD patients. But on the other hand, I feel that these patients, they don't behave like typical COPD. So they don't have typical comorbidities what we see with the smoker COPD. So comorbidities in these patients are also bit less as compared to the COPD. So in the management, I think inhaled corticosteroids along with your LABA, LAMA, so triple drug therapy in most of the patients remain the key in the management. And along with this, we have to identify these patients so that we should be able to control the exacerbations by adding inhaled corticosteroids at an early stage. So I think that is how I treat my patients with asthma COPD overlap.
Thank you, Dr. Modi. I think you have cleared, as the name suggests, there is overlapping in symptoms of asthma and COPD. There is overlapping in the approach as well as in the treatment. So there is an intermixing between the two major, of course, asthma and COPD diseases, entities. So I'm again asking question to you only, Dr. Modi, that is, what is major difference in previous gold guidelines and these gold guidelines, means what is new have been added to these gold guidelines, new guidelines?
So in the new gold guidelines, what we were discussing up till now, gold category A, B, C and D. So where your FEV1 as well as your FEV1 by FPC, that doesn't hold true. It is basically based upon your patient symptomatology, MMRC and CAT score and the exacerbations, that remains same. But what has been newly added is especially in patients with category D, where you have a choice of giving these patients LABA plus ICS, especially if these patients are having, as we discussed in the last question, if they have eosinophilia or if they have features of recurrent exacerbations, or the patients who have chronic bronchitis phenotype more than the emphysema. So LABA ICS still remains good standard of treatment for many of these patients. So that is one major difference what the GOAL 2020 has made. And second is for category B patients. Earlier we used to always start with LAMA. Over here they are saying LABA-LAMA combination, and the newer LAMA, especially like glycopyrronium, can be used in these particular patients. So otherwise the category wise GOAL 2020 doesn't differ much as compared to, but only difference what I feel is again the category C patients, where they have given the patient those who are just having recurrent exacerbations, they may not be more symptomatic. So I think these are the category of patients who are behaving more like asthma. So they are silent, and in between only they develop attacks and they get exacerbations. So I think this is a different category of patients what we normally don't see in our practice. We tend to see category B and category D patients only, and category D are the one which can be managed with LABA ICS. That is the major difference what GOAL 2020 has given us.
Wonderful, Dr. Modi. So I think you are continuously being bombarded with the questions. So another question is, what is the role of azithromycin in the prophylaxis of COPD?
Okay, good. We are going towards one phenotype of COPD. Basically, especially I still like to phenotype these patients as chronic bronchitis and emphysema. Okay, if you see our previous classification where we used to define the patients clinically whether they are chronic bronchitis and macrolides especially work in patients those who are, despite of their therapy with LABA-LAMA or maybe LABA-LAMA ICS, despite of this therapy also these patients they keep on getting exacerbations. So especially chronic bronchitis subset of the individuals where the role of azithromycin for a prophylactic basis is definitely there. So normally I tend to give 500 milligram alternate days, maybe for 6 months to 1 year. Or if you are giving 250 milligram, then alternate days maybe 1 year to 2 years. So exact time duration we cannot say. Yesterday only we had a talk on ICS where in the Indian Chest Society where the it was prolonged for quite a long many periods years as well. And especially I think chronic bronchitis subset prevent recurrent exacerbations, and we should just make sure that we are not having azithromycin or a macrolide resistant strain in as a colonizer in these patients of COPD before starting these patients with azithromycin prophylaxis. So these are some takeaways, but yes, definitely they do have, but always manage your patients first with LABA-LAMA or with LABA-LAMA ICS. Despite of that, if they are getting recurrent exacerbations, rule out there are no resistant strains, rule out there are no MAC infection or atypical mycobacterial infection, and that's the time then you can actually introduce azithromycin in.
So that's the message, Dr. Modi. That's the message.
Thank
that
you.
adequate optimized inhalation therapy is the best prophylaxis. That's the message. Okay, so the question to Dr. Shubhakar Kandi again, tuberculosis. Can you give ethionamide when there is a INH resistance?
Resistance, and you must know which mutation it is. Whether it is a CAT-G mutation or NHA mutation. If there is an INHA mutation, you cannot give ethionamide. If there is a CAT-G mutation, high dose INH will not work. So if there is, you have to look for the INHA mutation. If the INHA mutation is there, you can't give ethionamide. Those are cases you can't give a shorter MDR ratio.
Okay. Another question for you. In one of my patients, CBNet and LPA showed rifampicin resistance and liquid culture showed rifampicin sensitive. How can I proceed?
This is sometimes you get these problems because here the CBNAT and LPA are the genotype.
Yeah, they are showing resistance, rifampicin resistance.
Yeah, the liquid culture is a phenotypic test.
Yes.
So whenever there is a discordance between the genotypic test and phenotypic test, the only answer for this is gene sequencing.
Yeah.
Viral sequencing or whole genome sequencing. You can know because the gene expert and LPA will detect even silent mutations also. So it gives a false rifampicin resistance. So the only answer for these situations is the gene sequencing. Unfortunately, the gene sequencing facilities are not available everywhere. That's why it will be a problem. More than that, you have to take the history into consideration, whether you are dealing with a new case or a repeat case. Because we are not treating the reports, we are treating the patients. So history of background treatment, those things are also important in taking care.
Another question, Dr. Shubhankar, for you, that is 6 months of anti-tubercular treatment is sufficient for spinal tuberculosis?
I think you have to see the document of Index TB guidelines. They have beautifully described how to diagnose extrapulmonary TB, how long you have to treat it. In that, each subject expert has given their opinion on diagnosis as well as treatment. Coming to the spinal tuberculosis, it's a disseminated form of tuberculosis. So the 6 months is not enough. So minimum of 9 to 12 months, and you can extend up to 18 months. And one more important point to take a decision on how long to treat is the clinical follow-up, the radiological stability. All these things also to be taken into consideration. Considering all these issues, a minimum of 9 to 12 months is needed for spinal TB, and you can extend up to 18 months. So the treating physician has to take a call. It may be individualized. In some cases, may need 9 months or 12 months. Some cases may need 18 months. So that is why case-to-case basis, you may have to extend the treatment in spinal tuberculosis.
Thank you, Dr. Shubhankar. Another question for you, that patient of suspected pulmonary tuberculosis, but not raising the sputum. So what is your personalized approach for that patient?
First of all, sorry, I have to correct you. Suspect is the term which was objection by the human rights. So they have replaced the suspect with the presumptive TB. So in the case of presumptive TB, if there is no sputum, particularly in pediatric cases where they cannot produce sputum below 7 years. So you have to induce the sputum and do a gastric lavage, even a nasopharyngeal. In fact, recently the WHO has endorsed CBNAT for even the stool sample cells. So you can take any one sample, and if sample, maybe even nasopharyngeal swab in children also can be taken and do a CBNAT test. And in particular in children, you have to do an upfront CBNAT test. Based on the result, you can proceed.
Thank you, Shubhankar. Yeah. So now the question coming to the interstitial lung disease. So the two questions for the interstitial lung disease. And of course, our ILD expert is Dr. Apar Jindal. Dr. Jindal, so two questions for you. So should I come one by one or should I ask two simultaneously?
Both are okay.
Okay, both is okay for you. So first question is, what is the treatment of ILD and prognosis? I think it's not question, it's essay. So can you summarize in short how to approach the, of course, what is the treatment of ILD? And of course, what is its prognosis? Two questions for you.
So I think you rightly said it's not a question, it's an essay. We need the whole webinar or maybe even multiple webinars to discuss the whole. So I'd like to keep it very short over here, just into key bullet points. I think the first thing when we talk about the treatment of ILD is we need to classify and we need to diagnose accurately is what kind of ILD are we dealing with. Are we dealing with an IPF variety? Are we dealing with a CTD related ILD? Or are we dealing with a garden variety of progressive fibrosis ILD? Is it an IPAP? So once we've come to a final diagnosis as to what we're dealing with, we can start treating it. If we are looking at an IPF variety, we treat it with antifibrotics. If we are treating with something which is a CTD related ILD, now whether it is scleroderma or whether it is a rheumatoid ILD or the other forms, MCTD and others, then appropriate agents can be started. You can start with a steroid therapy. You can add on a steroid sparing drug. So which will be again disease specific. You can start with cyclophosphamide or MMF or azathioprine depending upon the underlying etiology over there. And if you're dealing with a progressive fibrosing ILD, I think a combination of everything, maybe a small dose of steroid and steroid sparing immunosuppressive, along with an upfront antifibrotic would be the thing. But beyond that, going beyond the pharmacological therapy, there are two other things that really need to be stressed upon. One is timely initiation of oxygen therapy as and when these patients need. And the secondly is to initiate pulmonary rehabilitation. Like in COPD, it is also very important to realize the importance of preserving the musculature of these patients as well. Otherwise, they tend to deteriorate very rapidly. And then obviously, when everything else fails, we need to think about lung transplantation. So having said that, when everything else fails, but we should really not offer it to the patient as the last therapy just before they are about to enter onto the ventilator. We have to start talking to the patient as and when we diagnose an ILD, and once we have established that the ILD in the patient is progressing, we have to give them the option right at that point of time and start prepping them up for this option as well, because this may be the last option for their survival. Now, coming to your second question, sir, regarding the prognosis of ILD. Again, this is a very variable prognosis. Like, if to put it in a nutshell, we have seen that the survival or the median survival varies somewhere between 3.5 years to all the way from 5 years to up to 7 years, wherein IPF having the worst survival and the CTD or the RA-ILD having the best survival of up to 7 years. So the range is over there. Of course, again, now I'd like to bring in lung transplantation here. When we bring that option to the patient, the survival and the prognosis changes a bit. Patients of IPF who would not survive beyond 3.5 years, provided that they don't have too many exacerbations in between, because we know that the survival post-exacerbation is only 20%, they can be offered a new lease of life with the option of transplantation. So I think in a nutshell, that is the answer that I'd like to put in over there.
Thank you, Dr. Apar. You have very briefly, of course, summarized the very long question. It is very difficult to speak small rather than to speak large. So I think this quality you have, that's wonderful. So Dr. Sonia, welcome to, of course, this is for you. What factors would you trump in as risk factor for community acquired pneumonia?
Sir, we have always been knowing that age always has been the most important factor. Even if the recent COVID, we see that the age is the most important thing which needs to be considered. The other things that we need to consider is whether the patient is a smoker or not. And smoking and infection goes hand in hand. So if the patient has a smoking of more than 20 pack years, then the odds ratio is 2.9%, which is very high. The other things are the comorbidities which would be there. Having said that, if the patient comes with an community acquired infection, then we can also do the risk stratification of those patients. And when we do the risk stratification, then we have two scores that we do. One is the CURB 65 and the other is the pneumonia severity index. So these are the two things. I mean, on the OPD basis, if you ask me what am I supposed to do, I would just do CURB 65, which is the easiest thing, where I'm looking at whether the patient is confused or not, what is the blood urea nitrogen level of the patient, what's the respiratory rate, and what's the blood pressure and the age. And depending that scoring, I can do the risk stratification of my patient. And if you want to admit the patient, you can also do a pneumonia severity index, which is a long list of stratification, which includes the demographic data, the comorbid conditions, which is everything has given some score. And when you add it, and then it gives you an idea whether you need to treat this patient on an OPD basis, or it requires a short hospitalization, it requires admission in the wards or in the ICU. I hope I have answered my question.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you,
so Sonia has given answer very brilliantly. Of course, she's the young, dynamic, and of course, always bubbling with the knowledge. I have seen her in so many conferences. Whenever a lady stands up for the question, it means Dr. Sonia is there. So, now coming to Dr. Tampi is the question, very simple question. What is the role of oral bombuterol in the treatment of asthma?
Can you just repeat the question?
Role of bombuterol in asthma.
Salmeterol.
Bombuterol. It's an oral drug, bombuterol.
Yeah, Bombuterol.
Yeah, bombuterol.
Bombuterol is not a very commonly used oral drug.
Yeah.
Most of us tend to use, Bombuterol is not a very commonly used drug, and most of us prefer to use inhaled therapy. And therefore, being chest physician pulmonologists, we are dependent more on the inhaled forms of therapy, in which we have all the inhaled corticosteroids, which are so effective and which are delivered, right to the organ of interest, and they produce excellent, response in a very short time with a limited side effects. So I think earlier on, when we did not have such wonderful inhaled therapy, we used to resort to these kind of things, Bambutrol, but I don't think any of us today prescribes Bambutrol across the board.
Perfect. Yes, we don't think is hardly there any role for these drugs, because wonderful inhalation therapy has come. The only thing is that you have to comply the inhalation therapy. That is the issue. Issue is not what is the wonderful, issue is that you comply the inhalation therapy, and that is the real problem in our country. Dr. Tampi, another question for you. Patient is asymptomatic, but on physical examination, you are getting bronchi, bilateral diffuse bronchi. Patient has been diagnosed as bronchial asthma, but now currently asymptomatic, but bronchi are present. Will you prescribe inhalation therapy?
No, what my approach would be, I would like to first establish a diagnosis in this patient.
Of course.
Now, you see, the history is very important. Does he have a history of chronic allergic rhinitis? Does he have a history of wheezing, sneezing? All these things will be very important in the history. Any history of recurrent cough, breathlessness, or allergic cough due to any dust allergy? Does he have a history of smoking, etc.? All these need to be taken into consideration. And then you clinically examine and you find just a few bronchi. Well, then my next step would be to probably, get a chest X-ray done and a lung function testing. I think that would be very, very important in this setting to establish whether the patient has a bronchial asthma to start with, or is it a COPD with irreversibility, or or something else altogether. All that wheezes is not asthma is something that we have been taught since our college days. All that wheezes is not asthma. So we need to be careful and not treat every case as an asthmatic. There are so many other, mimics which can, cause this kind of situation. Vocal cord paralysis, just to name a few of these, which can cause problems. So we need to first confirm the diagnosis before we establish treatment of asthma.
Okay. Before I ask a new question to you, Dr. Tampi, I think you have beautifully summarized that first we have to establish the diagnosis of asthma, because every wheeze is not asthma. All differential diagnoses, they have been, of course, ruled out. And then it's not necessarily that patient may be symptomatic on at rest. Patient may be symptomatic on exertion. So this kind of history also should be taken, that when becomes symptomatic, during exertion, during exercise, whatever it is. And then, of course, if you establish the diagnosis, you have to prescribe inhalation therapy. It doesn't mean whether patient is symptomatic at rest or not. So what is another question, Dr. Tampi, for you. What is the role of agelastin in the management of allergic rhinitis?
Yeah, agelastin is a newer generation antihistaminic, which is mainly directed to the treatment of allergic rhinitis. So as we know that allergic rhinitis is associated with asthma in a large percentage of cases. People of rhinitis, almost 40% of them have asthma, and almost 30 to 80% of asthmatics have allergic rhinitis. So having said that, it is one airway, one organ. That is the theory that we follow. Right from the nose to the alveolus, it is one organ. And therefore, if you are able to treat the allergic rhinitis part with a good new generation antihistaminic like agelastin, that will produce a control of the allergic rhinitis, and which would also, prevent the episodes of asthma, exacerbation, wheezing, etc. Generally, these days, agelastin is combined with a nasal steroid, either with a fluticasone or, combination, and which acts as an anti-inflammatory in the nose as well. And this gives a dual action against antihistaminic as well as anti-inflammatory drug, and therefore produces a good response to allergic rhinitis. Good treatment.
Okay, thank you. So after this 2-3 questions on asthma, now coming to the COPD. Dr. Modi, have attention to me. Dr. Modi, this is question for you. What is the role of acebrophylline in the management of COPD?
Acebrophylline, I feel it's overrated. It's a bronchodilator, mucokinetic, mucolytic, and anti-inflammatory properties. That's what it claims to be. But I feel the role is always an additive role. So when we have a patient of COPD and we have given optimum bronchodilation, maybe with a LAMA plus LABA or a triple combination, and if the patient's symptoms are not getting controlled, so that is the time I think we can add these newer derivatives like acebrophylline. And most of the times I feel only one useful criteria in most of the patients is to prevent nighttime symptoms. So just like our theophylline derivatives, where we have always used them basically to prevent nighttime symptoms, the same way I think acebrophylline does act in a sustained release formulation. If we give them, normally I give it in once a day or at night formulation, so where they tend to decrease your nighttime symptoms. So I think in many of the patients, as a co-treatment along with your LABA, LAMA and adequate bronchodilation, where we are using acebrophylline in these patients. Maybe one
Okay, Dr.
advantage as compared to your theophylline and doxophylline is it's a cardiac safety drug as compared to your other derivatives of theophylline. So tachycardia and arrhythmias, they will be less as compared to other derivatives of theophylline.
Thank you, Dr. Modi. So acebrophylline is the most preferred now oral drug for the these kinds of patient. And Dr. Modi has very well explained the role of acebrophylline in the management of COPD patient. Now the question in the field of vaccine. So Dr. Mehul, this is the question for you. Can we give Prevnar 13 and flu vaccine on the same day to the patient?
Both are different type of vaccines. One is a killed and one is a component vaccine, but I would still prefer to give it on 2 separate days. I understand patient has to come back for 2 separate visits, but it is better to give it on 2 separate days because any vaccine can have an idiosyncratic reaction which you don't want to attribute, or we would not know what to attribute to which vaccine. Usually the killed vaccine influenza is egg-based vaccine, so you can get an allergic reaction to that if you are allergic to egg. And the component vaccine, I would prefer to give it at least 3 or 7 days later. It will be not on the same day.
Some prefer that even you can give on the same day, but as Dr. Mehul has preferred to avoid this kind of same day practices. But I think both kind of practices are going on. But Dr. Mehul is preferring that it should be avoided giving on the same day. Another question, Dr. Mehul, for you related to the sleep. That lifestyle, non-medical and surgical options. I think it's again as a type of question for a snoring patient with normal AHI.
So the normal AHI, if the patient has a normal AHI, the patient complains of just snoring, you need to look at a lot of factors, whether there is any, in children especially, you get adenoid hypertrophy. They snore a lot and they may not have sleep apnea. The AHI may be near, I mean, if you do a sleep study, the AHI would be normal. Patients may also have allergic rhinitis in adults, which might lead to snoring and which may be a cause for concern rather than the sleep apnea per se. So in such patients, treating the allergic rhinitis part, taking care of the obesity, avoiding the alcohol or sedatives, and that is something which helps reduce the snoring part in such patients. If you have normal AHI, look for other factors also. Is there any obstructive element? There is something called as DISE, which is called as a sleep endoscopy, done by our ENT colleagues, which help us to find out the level of obstruction in such patients and probably treat accordingly. And the lifestyle disorders, as is with any other disorder, like avoid alcohol, weight loss, avoiding caffeine before sleeping. These are the things which I would advise to the patients.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mehul. After a short, of course, interval, I will come again to you. Dr. Tampi, this is again question for you. What is the role of immunotherapy in IgE-mediated asthma, and how you personalize have the personal experience for it? Immunotherapy in asthma.
Dr. Thampi, you are muted. You unmute your mic.
Oh, am I audible now? Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. So the first thing that you need to establish is that the patient is allergic to what are the allergens that he is allergic to. Now, having said that, you can do either a skin prick test or, where the, skin is pricked with the various allergens and you see the reaction on the skin, and that is read off by an allergologist, or some people, even the pulmonologist do these days. So now either that kind of a test or a blood test, which can measure the specific Ig against a particular allergen. So having said that, once you have identified the culprit allergen, then the aim would be to try and desensitize you over a period of time, which may take up to years, desensitize you to that particular allergen. So initially, the visits for these injections of desensitization would be probably 3 times a week, and gradually over a period of time you would become desensitized to that particular allergen. It may take up to a year or even more, depending on that. I would like to add that there is something known as SLIT, or sublingual immunotherapy. Sublingual immunotherapy is like giving a tablet which is placed under the tongue, and this has a lot of many allergens which are added in that, and if you can identify the kind of allergens, this can be used without any injections, and giving the patient any kind of injections over such a long period. You can use it as just a tablet in sublingually, and that is equally effective in desensitizing these patients to the particular allergen which is causing the asthma in this patient.
Thank you, Dr. Thampi. You are right that proper selection of patient is very important for allergy testing and specific immunotherapy. And then, of course, you should not use multiple allergens. Maximum in India, the Indian guidelines say that maximum 5 allergens can be chosen. And usually it is effective in, of course, the house dust mite, the pollen allergens, and of course the fungus allergens. So such kind of thing, and of course proper selection, detailed history and everything. Patient should not be in stage 5. So in 3-4 stages you can take the patient for the allergy testing and specific immunotherapy. Now the question, Dr. Shubhankar, again for you. So maximally 8 from India to US. So Dr. Shubhankar, the question for you is, what is the role of Gene Expert Plus in Antium and its reliability?
You need to unmute. You need to unmute, sir.
Yeah. So, Gene Expert has no role in the diagnosis of Antium. Suppose if you see sputum is positive, Gene Expert is negative, immediately you should come into mind that you are dealing with non-tuberculous.
Dr. Shubhankar, question is related to Gene Expert Plus.
Whatever may be, Gene Expert or Gene Expert Plus, we detect only MTB only. If Gene Expert positive means there is no dispute in the diagnosis, it's only you are dealing with a typical mycobacteria. Non-typical mycobacteria, as of today, the only diagnostic test available in India is only a liquid culture. That too, not a single culture. It is a sputum. You have to send 3 samples, or 3. If 2 are positive, you take it as an NTM. Or you can take a bronchial wash. Even 1 sample positive, culture positive, also can be taken as NTM. Or biopsy sample also. Now, in Western countries, there are LPA kits for non-tuberculous mycobacteria. As in today, the Gene Expert will detect only typical mycobacterium, either Gene Expert Ultra or Gene Expert, regular Gene Expert. The advantage of Ultra is even 15.6 bacilli there in the specimen, you can detect typical mycobacteria.
Question for you, miliary tuberculosis. how will you treat miliary tuberculosis? What is the regimen? What kind of treatment you offer?
Yeah. Miliary tuberculosis is a disseminated form of tuberculosis. So first of all, you have to establish the diagnosis as miliary TB. Organs involved in that, you must assess. So you may have to extend the duration of treatment for miliary tuberculosis. And there is a role of steroids also in miliary tuberculosis. But you should not start steroids directly. You must start ATT first and see the response. The patient is responding to your ATT, you can give a short course of steroids in miliary tuberculosis.
Okay, now, again coming to Dr. Tampi. Dr. Tampi, this is a question about the diagnostic test. The question is, how reliable is ImmunoCAP?
As far as the evidence goes, ImmunoCAP is basically a broad-based test which is giving you information, to various allergens. But you need to basically, sensitize the, identify the allergen. So ImmunoCAP would probably give you a host of allergens to which the person is allergic to. But to identify, I still feel that you need to go in for skin prick test and or a RAST and identify the allergen specifically. You just get a broad idea in an ImmunoCAP. But I think it is better to go in for the good skin prick test and or the RAST, which will help us identify the allergen.
Dr. Sonia, question for you. Able to hear me?
Yes,
Dr.
yes,
Sonia?
sir.
Okay,
Yes,
this
sir.
is question to you. How to differentiate between community-acquired pneumonia and COVID pneumonia?
So the presentations are going to be the same, more or less, right? But if you look at the radiology, COVID has some classical radiological features. When you have, subpleural consolidations, you should suspect that the patient has a COVID pneumonia. COVID again is a type of a viral pneumonia, which is going to be, a community-acquired infection. So, if you get an X-ray done, X-ray has got bilateral subpleural opacities and some ground glass haziness on an X-ray, you have to suspect that the patient probably has a COVID infection. If the patient has a lobar consolidation with some air bronchogram seen, probably the patient has a community-acquired infection for which you can, get the tests done. If you get a CT scan done, normally we don't get CT scans for the COVID. However, if you get a CT scan done, initially you have a ground glass haziness, then you have a consolidation which is absolutely subpleural, basal, and then later on you also have a presentation of a cryptogenic organizing pneumonia or a BOOP-like picture. So those are the stages where you see, you can say that this is a classical of a COVID pneumonia, and the sensitivity of this test to diagnose a COVID pneumonia on a CT scan is around 90 to 95%.
Thank you, Dr. Sonia. Thank you, Dr. Sonia. It's a very obvious. Take the background history of COVID if there is a history of contact with a COVID patient. And then, of course, the clinical picture and, of course, radiological picture is very important, as Sonia has mentioned. And overall, you have to test the COVID. Whether it's pneumonia of any else, the first thing is you have to test the COVID. If it is positive,
so in this
then of
pandemic,
course,
in this pandemic, whatever presentation on X-ray, first get a COVID test done.
Yes,
That's it.
first get COVID test. If it is positive, then go for the COVID, and otherwise non-COVID. Thank you. So, Dr. Apar Jindal. Okay, yeah, Apar is there. So, Dr. Apar, it is your favorite question, I would say. What are the indications of lung transplant?
Okay, so yeah, so as you've hit it, it is part of my favorite topic, lung transplantation. So when we talk about indications for lung transplantation, I would say there are two steps to answer this question. There are three basic indications that we need to look at. Firstly, the patient should be suffering from a chronic ailment, a chronic lung disease, in which the chances of mortality in the next 2 years is more than 50% for the patient. Secondly, the patient from a transplant point of view should have adequate reserve, body reserve, such that his survival likelihood post-transplant should be at least 90 days, more than 80% likelihood of that. And then thirdly, from a general medical perspective, we assume that the lung is going to be well functional, but from the general medical perspective, taking into account the comorbidities that the patient has, his survival likelihood for the next 5 years should be more than 80%. So if all these conditions are fulfilled, we then look at disease-specific criteria for indications to lung transplantation. So very simply put, all ILDs are indications to lung transplant, especially fibrosing ILDs. Right at the time of diagnosing a fibrosing ILD, we should talk to the patient about lung transplantation. Then these patients can be followed up, wherein an institution of oxygen therapy, appearance of pulmonary hypertension, or an FVC of less than 80% or a DLCO of less than 40% is an indication for referring the patient. When we come to COPD, once we have achieved optimal bronchodilator therapy for the patient, we have instituted oxygen therapy, we have rehabbed the patient, and now if we are in the area that we have to use NIV, or we have the patient who is in a board category of board index 5 or 6, or appearance of pulmonary hypertension, or despite these all therapies being instituted, the patient is still progressing. This is a patient who would fit for the bill for lung transplantation. When we talk about bronchiectasis, obviously bilateral bronchiectasis with a worsening disease, with the appearance of pulmonary hypertension, life-threatening or significant or recurrent episodes of hemoptysis, utilizing more and more antibiotics with frequent exacerbations. These are the cases who would go for lung transplantation. And then finally, coming to the category of pulmonary vascular disorders. So any patient who requires incremental number and incremental types of drugs for the treatment of pulmonary hypertension. Unfortunately, we don't have IV and inhalational therapy available with us. So mostly all the patients with pulmonary hypertension fit into this bill. When we talk about pulmonary vascular occlusive diseases or venous diseases, then all patients, this is the only choice what they have. The other category that we deal with is the patients with congenital heart disease who develop either Eisenmenger's or who go on to develop pulmonary hypertension. These are again the patients who should be referred for lung transplantation. The question is now here to decide whether they need just a lung transplantation with correction of the underlying deformity, or whether they would go for a combined heart and lung transplant depending upon their right ventricular and left ventricular failure. So if we have a combined heart and a lung failure, then they would go for a combined heart and lung transplant.
Thank you, Apar. You can speak day and out in this topic, on this topic, your favorite topic. Now, of course, coming to Dr. Tampi again. So, Dr. Tampi, what is the role of biologicals in asthma?
That's a these days that is becoming more and more popular. But to understand the use of biological asthma, I think it is important to understand the concept of severe asthma. Now, when you talk about severe asthma, it constitutes probably 5 to 10% of the asthmatics that we see in our daily practice. Most of them are difficult to control asthmas, and those difficult to control asthmas need to be addressed with things like, the contributory factors which are creating a problem in the control of asthma. For example, the adherence problem, the inhaler technique, the dosage, frequency, all these need to be checked. Having excluded all these factors, the contributory factors which are creating a problem for the control of asthma, you will probably be left with less than 5% which are really severe asthmatic. Now, this is the group of patients that who are, despite step-by treatment of GINA, with all your oral corticosteroids, inhaled steroids, some of them would need to be put, to undergo phenotyping. Now, what is phenotyping? Phenotyping is basically observable risk factors, and endotype is to identify the pathophysiological mechanisms in it. So those segment of severe asthma patients who have got an endotype in which there is a T2 high or a T2 low kind of asthma that we are now classifying them into. So the T2 high ones are those which are associated with raised IgE, with raised eosinophils in the sputum and blood, with raised FeNOs, fractional expired nitric oxide. These are the set of patients that may benefit with biologicals. And what are these biologicals? You have anti-IgE, which many or most of us are familiar with, omalizumab, which has been around for quite a few years now. And then you can think the newer ones are the anti-IL-5, interleukin 5 and interleukin 5 receptor, and the interleukin 4. Okay, so you have interleukin 5, mepolizumab and reslizumab, and so on, which are now becoming available. Mepolizumab has been around for quite some time. It is one of the companies marketed as Nucala, and that is the news, and people have been using that successfully. In this small subset of patients, I would like to re-emphasize that the use of biologicals is only in a very small segment of severe asthmatics that are identified to have the inflammatory mediators, which can be, blocked with the help of the anti-IgEs or anti-IL-5s or anti-IL-4 and so on. I hope that answers your question, sir.
Wonderful answer. Dr. Sonia, the question for you. What are the indications for surgery in fungal pulmonary infections?
So,
Sonia,
yes, I got it, sir. So, in fungal pulmonary infection, unless you have, aspergilloma, when you have aspergilloma and the patient has got massive hemoptysis, and if the patient has got a localized disease, then the patient can undergo a surgery in form of a lobectomy or a segmentectomy. If the patient, hello, am I audible?
You are audible, very well audible.
Yes. So, if the patient has aspergilloma, and in aspergilloma, if the cavity is there, patient has got complications because of that, and if it is a localized disease, then the patient can undergo a segmentectomy or a lobectomy. Right, sir? Otherwise, for invasive fungal infection, there is no indication for surgery. None of the other reasons are there for indication of surgery.
Another question for you, Dr. Sonia. Community-acquired pneumonia and cardiovascular risk.
So it is a double-edged sword. So if the patient has got a community-acquired pneumonia, he has got 30% chances of developing a cardiovascular complications. As against that, if a patient has got cardiovascular disease, he also has a risk to develop pneumonia compared to a normal person. And the selection of the antibiotic also differs, because the bugs would also differ if the patient has got a cardiovascular risk, underlying cardiovascular disease.
Now, this is question to, again, Dr. Apar Jindal. Dr. Jindal. Yes, now you are in the focus. Now, Dr. Jindal, UIP and NSIP, how difficult is to differentiate, and of course, clinically as well as radiologically?
So, clinically, of course, it will be very difficult unless you have a good history from the patient that associated features are there. If you have a classical patient where, you have an elderly 5th decade or 6th decade patient who's been having slow progression of the disease with cough, breathlessness, you can kind of think towards IPF, you would think that you'll be dealing with a UIP pattern. And when you see it otherwise, when you have a young patient, when you have atypical features, when you have features of connective tissue disorders associated with it, you would think to tend towards a NSIP pattern. Now, more important over here than clinical features or symptomatology would be to look at the radiographic picture over here. So when we have a combination of traction bronchiectasis, bronchiolectasis, along with honeycombing and absence of other features which prove it to be other than UIP, we are dealing with a definite UIP pattern. Now, plus minus honeycombing over here and the absence of other features, then again we are looking at a probable UIP pattern over here. And when these other features are present, features like subpleural sparing, features like spatial homogeneity, features like presence of multifocal consolidations or presence of multifocal ground glassing or throughout ground glassing in the lungs. So those are the features where you would tend to think towards an NSIP pattern. So rather than saying that there is a difficult gradient to pick between UIP or NSIP, I would say that it is more prudent to go in a stepwise manner where you look at the clinical features, then look at the CT, and then you follow each pattern with a given point, so that you can clearly differentiate between whether you want to place that CT into the bucket of UIP pattern or into an NSIP pattern. Of course, we do come across cases where overlaps may exist, and then it is a difficult case where you may need to follow it up. You may need to institute a multidisciplinary discussion over there, and then or ultimately end up with a biopsy for the diagnosis.
Dr. Apar, another question for you. How to do confirmatory diagnosis for scleroderma?
Okay, so I think that's a very good question. So again, a multi-pronged approach. So your mic was muted. Couldn't hear that. So again, I would say again a multi-pronged approach to the diagnosis would be required, where you look at the symptomatology, you look at the clinical features. Scleroderma is not just a lung disease. We need to remember that it is a combination of multiple systems. It involves all the various systems. You need to look at the skin for skin features. You need to look at the nails for skin tightening. You need to look at the mouth for skin tightening features. You need to assess the GI tract for any esophageal dysmotility symptoms, any symptoms of reflux, chest pain symptoms. Then you need to also look for the lung signs over here. So usually scleroderma again can present either with a UIP or an NSIP kind of a pattern. So radiographically that differentiation may not be that pronounced. But again, the differentiating point over here would then come down to the serological testing, where you would like to test for the antibodies. So presence of SCL70 antibody would prompt you towards the diagnosis of scleroderma. We need to test for these. And then ultimately, if the patient permits and if the circumstances are favorable, we can go for a biopsy to establish what we are dealing with.
Okay, Dr. Jindal. Now we are going to Dr. Mehul. Dr. Mehul, this is question not on vaccine, but it is on sleep. The question is, what is the role of sildenafil in treatment of pulmonary hypertension associated with obstructive sleep apnea? Role of sildenafil in the management of pulmonary hypertension associated with OSA.
So the pulmonary hypertension that usually develops in OSA would be because of chronic hypoxia. So that would prompt me to look for OHS more than OSA. So an obesity hyperventilation syndrome is what I would look for in such patients who have chronic, hypoxia and maybe a chronic daytime hypercapnia also. So managing such patients with, if there is evidence of hypoxia, treating their hypoxia, and managing sleep apnea depending on the AHI and the surgical requirement, managing them with a positive airway pressure machine like a CPAP or a BiPAP depending on the condition would be more prudent rather than adding a vasodilator like sildenafil. So managing the basic conditions helps better, and that brings down the pulmonary pressures in at least 2 or 3 months' time. So I would probably not add sildenafil in such patients unless patient probably is very hypoxic and is hospitalized maybe for short term, but I don't see any evidence in that. So managing the primary hypoxia and hypercapnia is more important.
Dr. Apar, this is a specific question again for you. How to do polysomnography in a patient of COPD patient on LTOT?
A very difficult question indeed to answer.
That's why for you.
So it is a difficult scenario. Now, a patient who is on LTOT, the problem is there are 2 respiratory channels which we use. One is the nasal thermistor, which will pick up the temperature differences at the nares or in front of the oral cavity. Now, the ideology here is when there is a complete cessation or when there is a critical up to 90% decrease in the flow in the nasal cavity, which is termed as apnea, the thermistor is more valuable as compared to the flow detector for picking up the episode. And the other channel, as I told you, is the nasal flow detector. So this detects a decrease or an increase in flow. So here, when there is a 30%, 50% fall, which we know as hypoapnea, we can pick that up. In case of using LTOT, both these mechanisms are knocked out. So there is a continuous flow which happens into the nasal cavity by the use of oxygen. And also this is cold. The oxygen that we are supplying is at a lower temperature. So the thermistor also loses value. So we have to actually use a lot of clinical acumen over here. We need to identify what is the kind of patient that we are dealing with. Is this a patient who is in CO2 narcosis where the CO2 levels are very high? We have to look at the symptomatology. We have to find out whether the patient has all the features of sleep apnea. Is the snoring present? Is the snoring at this onset of sleep? Is it more towards the morning hours? Are there any witness choking incidents which are there or not? Once we have a strong suspicions for doing this sleep study, then I think we have to go ahead. So there are two ways of doing it. Either one, we use the nasal oxygen and we maintain a baseline. And this is a very difficult way to do it. And, only once you have a certain amount of experience with doing these studies, you can do it. So that baseline is used as a cutoff to reduce or to remove the noise, as we call it, or the events which continue to come up to that level, and then take into account the other events that are recorded. Or second option is you can use a pneumotachograph. So this is something like the BiPAP or the CPAP mask that we wear, which can pick up these flow differences which can be used. The benefit of using the pneumotachograph is you can not only pick up the airflow changes to identify hypoapneas and apneas, but you can use the same mask to continue over onto a titration aspect for the patient. So these are the two options. The other clinical variable that I would like to use in these patients is the ABG. So we do a difference, a morning ABG and evening ABG, which is related to adequate sleep provided to the patient, to see whether he is retaining CO2 in the sleep. If he is retaining CO2 in the sleep, then we can also think about sleep apnea in these patients and then go on directly for the therapy over there.
Thank you, Dr. Apan. Now coming to Dr. Shubhankar. Dr. Kandi, this is a question for you. Can we give all the anti-tubercular drugs as per DST for MDR and XDR along with the COVID treatment?
The COVID is no treatment.
Yeah.
There is a treatment for TB. Unfortunately, the mindset of entire healthcare professionals in the public is there is only one disease in this world, that is COVID. People are suffering from only COVID, not that. So you can use safely all the drugs. Of course, when you're giving this erythromycin, all those things, and then you're giving a bedaquiline along with this QT prolongation. So first thing is that TB is a treatable disease. Whereas all those treatment modalities, what we are giving COVID, is only a practical experience. There is no data as in today until the solidarity trial results comes to us.
That treat tuberculosis as per guidelines, as you don't have no specific treatment for COVID. So COVID has got only symptomatic treatment, so give a specific treatment for tuberculosis. So this is very much clear from Dr. Shubhankar Kandi. Now the question is, Dr. Modi, for you. Dr. Modi, question is, please tell how to do nicotine de-addiction in clinical practice.
Yes, nicotine de-addiction, as we all know that there are those 5 A's and you have to ask and assess and assist to the patient. So whenever the patient comes to you, I think the first thing what we need to do is we always write descriptions about COPD and about the bronchodilation, but we tend to forget to tell him about, asking him about to quit smoking. So first thing what is important is basically to convince him about the side effects and whatever the other effects of smoking. About specific nicotine de-addiction therapy, pharmacological therapy, if you ask me, I always give this medicine with only with Pfizer, which is available. That is your Champix. So this medicine I normally tend to give it for 3 months. And how I use it is, first is a 1 starter pack followed by 2 months of maintenance treatment. And along with this, I tend to give these patients nicotine chewing gums. So I ask them to use nicotine chewing gums as an SOS therapy along with your this pharmacological Champix therapy for 3 months period. And how to use the nicotine gums, I always tend to give them on a specific way, that if the patient feels to use say 10 times if he's urged to smoke, so I ask him to take 10 times of nicotine chewing gums, chew it and then park it under the tongue unless and until he gets the effect, the taste of it, and then to throw it away. So maybe for a week he is using around 8 to 10 chewing gums per day. Next week I ask him to deliberately decrease it to by 1, and then next week by 1 more. So he is trying to reduce the nicotine chewing gums from 10 to 8 to 7, 6, and after that once all the receptors of nicotine are fulfilled, and then even if the patient tries to smoke or if he smokes, he doesn't get that positive effect out of it because the all receptors are full, are already taken by the nicotine replacement therapy. So that's the reason that I always tend to give this nicotine chewing gums as an SOS therapy along with using your Champix or Varenicline therapy as for the de-addiction. And along with this, of course, the patient's counseling and then multiple counseling sessions, that is what is more required in these patients.
Thank you, Dr. Modi. Actually, I'm a little bit confused. I have not taken permission from Dr. Krishna or Dr. Narayana, the President Secretary of CCI, whether moderator can ask the question or not. So I'm taking the privilege of being moderator. Dr. Modi, do you think is there any role of yoga, asana, pranayama, meditation in the, of course, nicotine de-addiction?
Definitely. I mean, these are all additive therapies, and when we are asking the patient about quitting, we have to always give him all supplements and so that his mind also gets diverted, he gets engaged in some kind of activity. So I don't know exactly if there is any positive role of, but as an assist therapy for all this, so we should always ask your patients. But I think you must be knowing the answer. So please guide us about how. Yes.
I'm not having the answer. I'm having the interest in that. That is the problem. Yeah. So that was
we tend to give our patients all these suggestions, but I don't know exactly.
I think there is no harm, at least no harm, yeah. And of course a kind of diversion, as you mentioned. This can be the theory. This can be the mechanism behind it. So I'm really interested in the field of this yoga, asana, pranayama, and that was the story behind asking this question. Anyway, so now.
Sir, can I add one point? Sir,
yeah,
can I add one point?
Yeah, sure, ma'am, sir. Sure,
sir. It is a very nice rehabilitation program. You can inculcate yoga into a rehabilitation program, and the physical endurance of the patient increases tremendously. And patients are really very happy because when you inculcate meditation, yes, I agree with you.
Okay. So I'm getting more and more person. Yeah, Doctor.
Can I add a comment to that? I totally agree with both the speakers. But yoga, generally, if you have been a smoker and if you try to quit, you will realize the amount of mental and psychological stress that he goes through. And that is where the role of yoga comes in. It helps you meditate, helps you de-stress, and probably accept the inevitability that you need to give up smoking forever.
Yes, I think most of the time the stress is a precipitating factor to start the smoking or nicotine. Yeah, wonderful add-on, Dr.
Surikant.
Yeah, Shivankar, yes.
In fact, I think the John Hopkins University. In fact, Judge Vasudev.
Yeah.
He has started a trial on the effect of yoga on COVID. The John Hopkins University has started a trial.
Great.
Yoga and COVID.
Thank you.
Sir, I need to also add, sorry, sir.
Yeah.
So we already have a yoga program running at Jupiter Hospital where I'm practicing. And we have found good results for patients with chronic respiratory diseases, not specific, I would say, to smoking cessation, but overall. And some patients have been able to overcome their addictions, including alcohol and smoking. So if I may not be able to give you a study profile, but it definitely helps, sir.
Jindal, you are also agree?
Yeah, absolutely, sir.
So I think we are of same wavelength, we are of same frequency. I think the organizer have recruited the right panel, right moderator, and right expert. Okay, going to the next question. This question is to Dr. Tampi. Does all allergic rhinitis patient goes to asthma?
Yeah, very interesting question. Yes.
Yeah.
No, not necessarily that all allergic rhinitis should end up in asthma. But having said that, it's one airway, one organ. So therefore, a person who is atopic, has allergic rhinitis, chronic allergic rhinitis, is more prone to develop an asthma. And therefore, one must try to cap it right at the top. You attack the allergic rhinitis. To quote some figures, as I mentioned earlier, almost 40% of patients with allergic rhinitis have associated asthma. And about 30 to 80% of asthmatics have an associated allergic rhinitis. So you see the amount of percentage overlap in these two. So therefore, you cannot treat it as a separate disease. You need to attack it with everything that you have at your disposal to control the allergic rhinitis. Thereby, you would be taking care of the asthma as well.
Thank you, Dr. Tampi. I think it's a wonderful thing that this is my request to all pediatricians in this country, that every one patient out of 3 patients of allergic rhinitis may develop bronchial asthma. So I think you suspect everybody that he might be developing asthma, and of course he has to be screened for asthma. And similarly, BHS physician, every patient of asthma should be screened for the associated allergic rhinitis or sinusitis. So such kind of treaty should be done between the ENT, pediatrician and us. So you can take the asthma allergy triangle, like a love triangle. So such kind of thing you can do. The pediatrician at one end, ENT specialist at another end, and chest physician at third end. So a wonderful thing. It's direction. So now another question for Dr. Shubhankar. Dr. Shubhankar, what is the news about, I'm not talking of COVID vaccine, I'm talking of newer TB vaccines for you.
So I think that is an unfortunate thing. But COVID, in 3 months, there are 100 vaccine trials. I think there in the US, almost 5 companies are, in fact, the share value of Moderna company share value has gone from $80 to $230 once they have started this.
For trying to develop vaccine for COVID.
Yeah. So coming to BCG, I think only the 2 studies are going on. The recombinant BCG vaccine trial, because the rate of ending TB by 2025, the treatment of TB is not alone is sufficient. Prevention is also important. Preventive therapy, new BCG vaccinations like recombinant BCG vaccination. I think that recombinant BCG vaccine is going to come in 2027, what I came to know recently. Only 2 trials are going on the newer BCG vaccination.
Okay, thank you. This another question, of course, Dr. Apar Jindal again. Dr. Jindal, whether non-IPF patient having ALD with UIP pattern and fibrotic changes can be prescribed anti-fibrotic agents like pirfenidone?
Absolutely. So, I'd like to start answering with saying yes. So once we are dealing with fibrosis on the CT scans, once we are seeing fibrosis in any type of ILD, so we need to follow these patients up very closely. We need to see if they are progressing, whether they're experiencing a significant decline in their FVC, whether they're deteriorating symptomatically, clinically, whether their exercise capacity is going down. And in any case, since we are dealing with a fibrotic disease in them, we should upfront treat them with an antifibrotic.
Another question is related with, of course, Dr. Tampi. Dr. Tampi, this is also a debatable question for you. How long we can use montelukast?
Sorry, sir, can you repeat
How
that
long we can use montelukast? How long we can use montelukast?
Okay, very, very interesting question. So to start the ball rolling, montelukast is a 2nd generation antihistaminic which has been used widely across the board for the effective control of allergic rhinitis. Having said that, most of us pulmonologists also have been using it because it helps to control the exacerbation of asthma in many of our patients. However, a word of caution, in the GINA 2020, there is FDA boxed warning regarding the deleterious effect of using montelukast in adults and in children. In adults, it can cause suicidal tendencies, and in children, neuropsychiatric manifestations, sleep disturbances, and hallucination. So therefore, today we need to relook at montelukast. Even pediatricians who are listening on warning that montelukast is known to cause neuropsychiatric manifestations and behavioral disorders in children. And with that, now you decide whether you want to use antihistaminics like levocetirizine or the desloratadine alone, or would you like to combine it with Montelukast, as most of the pharmaceuticals are now combining, Levocet M or Montelc and so on and so forth. I feel that unless I'm dealing with a allergic rhinitis associated patient, I would rather use pure antihistaminic rather than combine it with the Montelukast.
Thank you, Dr. Zampi. This is question for Dr. Mehul. Dr. Mehul, this is question related to vaccine.
Yes,
So this is related with swine flu vaccine, live attenuated nasal or killed injectable form, which is recommended and superior and safe.
So as I told you, the injectable vaccine is developed on egg-based cultures. So if you have an allergy to egg, that is out. So if there is no immunocompromised state, you can still give a live attenuated vaccine. But a kill vaccine would be safer in all population, I would feel, as we don't have to look out for an immunocompromised state. And as far as superiority is concerned, as far as my knowledge goes, I think both are equally efficacious in preventing. Live attenuated has there are some studies which show that it is superior, but I would prefer to give killed vaccine any day. In children, probably adding a live attenuated nasal vaccine would be preferable. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Dr. Sonia, this is question for you.
So Dr. Gandhi wants to add something.
Okay. Dr. Gandhi, please.
Sir, you're muted. Sir, you're muted.
Yeah, please unmute. Dr. Gandhi, please unmute.
Add to some.
Yeah, now you are audible.
So, I think in the present COVID era, I don't advise the nasal vaccine which here.
Can you repeat? Can you repeat? I think it was not audible for all of us.
The live vaccine is a nasal spray vaccine.
Yeah.
So it's not given an immunocompromised individuals.
Okay, and it should not be given in
COVID era. I don't
considering the present COVID era. Yeah, that's good. That's good idea. So, Dr. Sonia, which microbiological investigation need to be performed for community-acquired pneumonia?
So, sir, basically it is the sputum test which needs to be done. But on an OPD basis, if the patient does not have any comorbid conditions, if the patient is just coming with a community-acquired infection, it's only the X-ray chest which would probably give us an answer that the patient is suffering from a pneumonia. 60 to 70% of the times in an immunocompetent patient, we have Streptococcus pneumoniae. So we know what we treat for that Streptococcus. We have to treat the Streptococcus pneumoniae. 30% of the times it would be atypical bacteria. Having said that, if the patient needs admission, in that case, the first thing we have to do is a blood culture, and also you get a sputum test done. Sputum, first you get a gram stain done. If you have a good microbiologist, on the gram stain itself he'll say that the patient has got Streptococcus or not. And then you can get a culture done. And we are staying in a country which is very common with tuberculosis. So always get a sputum for AFP done once the patient gets admitted. And the other test, if you're suspecting atypical, you can get an immunofluorescence test for an atypical panel for Legionella, Mycoplasma and Chlamydia.
Great, Sonia. Okay. So this is the complete profile you can advise. Dr. Mehul, next question for you. How to manage obstructive sleep apnea in a patient who is not compliant or not willing to use CPAP machine? So what are the other alternatives?
Okay, so the other alternatives, I would say CPAP is not the ultimate treatment. So don't offer your patients as this is the ultimate treatment for your patient. You have to look for other risk factors or other comorbidities in your sleep apnea patients. Most of the common thing missed is an obstructive airway disease underlying. So all your sleep apnea patients have to undergo a PFT or a clinical examination to look out for OAD and manage the obstructive airway disease. That was the first thing. Lifestyle changes of cutting down on alcohol, reducing their weight, starting breathing exercises or chest physiotherapy does help in such patients. There are certain, mandibular enhancing therapies, all those things which probably won't help. CPAP therapy is to be used. Convince them that use this as a bridging therapy. Use the machine to lose the machine. If you don't use it, you're not going to lose it. So other therapies would be sleep hygiene, which we tell our patients that not having caffeine at least 4 hours before sleeping, and having a balanced diet. All these things help. I think the majority has to go with lifestyle changes and convincing the patient for a CPAP therapy.
Okay, great. Dr. Sonia. Dr. Sonia, yeah, attention please, this is question for you. The question is related with histoplasmosis. How practical is the use of histoplasmin for the diagnosis of histoplasmosis?
Sir, histoplasmin is a ski test. So it would just tell that whether you have been exposed to histoplasma or not. Right? However, if you want to prove the infection in that patient, you need to do a blood antigen test along with identification of the histoplasma as a microbiology. So either you do a biopsy and grow the histoplasma, you do a lavage, or you get a sputum test done and prove it. Doing only a histoplasmin test does not prove that you have got histoplasmosis.
So, Dr. Sonia, another question for you. When to switch from a parenteral to oral antibiotics, and what should be the duration of therapy?
So, as Appar had said that he take an essay for that, like in ILD, I would also probably take an essay for the same. In a nutshell, if I want to just summarize one thing, it is like if a patient becomes hemodynamically stable, maintains oxygen without any oxygen therapy, and is mobilized, that is the time that you can switch over the patient from IV to oral. Now, how long, which is very important. First, it depends on the bug, what type of bug the patient is having. The other thing is the microbiome and the comorbid conditions. Now, if the patient has got only one bug, you can give that patient for 5 to 7 days. If the patient has got some other infection like meningitis, empyema, or arthritis, infective arthritis, you have to give it for a long time. If the patient has got a bug like staphylococcus or has a gram-negative infection or an atypical infection like Legionella or Mycoplasma, the therapy would go for a long time.
Yeah, Dr. Sonia.
I hope I've cleared.
Yeah. Okay. Dr. Shivankar, a very interesting question for you. I think we are heading towards the end of show, but still, till the organizers are, of course, allowing us, we will continue. Dr. Shivankar, very interesting question for you. In some countries, BCG is given twice. Why can't we give in India? Actually, I don't have an idea. So what? Expert comment.
I wrote an article on BCG in COVID era. The effect of BCG on COVID. The data shows where the BCG program is there, particularly Japan and India and some other countries where BCG vaccination is included in the universal vaccination program. The BCG there, the incidence of COVID is very less than compared to where there is a BCG. For example, in Europe, you have seen more number of cases and deaths also. So BCG has given, it's only a circumstantial evidence. BCG has given some protective effect not only for TB, even for COVID also. If you want to see the numbers, I think where the BCG program is there, the incidence is around 38.4 per lakh, whereas 10 times more where the BCG is not there. Similarly, to see the deaths where the BCG program is not there, so the mortality is around 4.2%. And where BCG program is there, the BCG mortality is almost 0.2 to 0.3%. Coming to your question, whether you can do, because the BCG is giving some protection. So BCG in Changalpur trial 1960 had proved beyond doubt it won't prevent post-primary pulmonary tuberculosis. But why you are giving BCG? Because it prevents the disseminated forms of pulmonary tuberculosis. That is the reason we are giving a BCG, even though the universally a global failure of BCG vaccination. Coming to the second question, whether you can do BCG again, I think you have to do a study. First of all, You have to assess whether the previous BCG has, what is the protective. First of all, if its protection is there or not. If protection wanes off, and giving one more dose of BCG. In fact, in Australia, they are doing a study. Australia, Netherlands, and some of the also they are doing a BCG, even though BCG is not given in US. Now they are giving a trial of BCG, whether it has any effect in preventing other infections, because BCG has proved beyond doubt. It not only prevents the tuberculosis to a certain extent, it also prevents other infections also. In fact, there are trials of BCG in sepsis also. So giving a second dose of BCG is, I think, unless you do a trial, you can't. I can't give as an expert. So you have to do a study, see the effect, and then only can.
Dr. Shivankar, you are right. There are a lot of papers now claiming of course, India has protected itself because of the BCG vaccination for last so many decades. I mean, debate is going on. That's a different issue.
It's only a circumstantial evidence.
Yeah.
That's why ICMR has, your institute is taken one of the, I believe.
Yeah.
ICMR has.
Our institute has been taken for so many things in
trial.
Yeah.
In fact, I am working on John Hopkins on this same trial.
Even Plasma Therapy Center has been chosen our King George Medical University Trial Center. Dr. Tampi, question for you. What do you think? What diet should be advised for asthmatics?
Oh, very interesting question.
Yeah.
Okay. As far as diet is concerned, there are no restrictions in asthmatics as such. Yes, there are certain food allergies that if somebody takes khatta, tomato or baygan, something like that, they are known to produce allergic response in that individual, and he develops, bronchospasm and goes breathing and things like that. It might set off acute asthma. Now, those people who have this kind of allergy to a particular food, we would rather like to advise them to stay away from that. Having said that, always fresh fruit and fresh veggies are safer than using tinned stuff, because the sulfite, in the metabolite sulfite, which is there in the tinned foods, can also spark off bronchospasm and acute exacerbation of asthma in these patients. So that is the diet that I would advise. The other thing is that regarding asthmatics, most of them, would like to stay away from cold items. And we always tell them that try not to take ice or ice cold soft drink or ice creams, because this impairs their, disease proneness to asthmatic attacks. So therefore, this is a broad guideline that you can use, and specific food allergies they should avoid.
I think the dietary perception in our population, in Indian population, this is too much. If you give very good prescription, very academic, highly, of course, the specific prescription, but there's still people ask, Doctor Saab, khana kya hai? वो तो बताया ही नहीं आपने. So dietary question is always, you see the kind of sweet dish type, dessert type of order in a restaurant. So it's the Indian patient population perception. So I think we are getting a lot of, after our yoga discussion, a lot of comments are coming, especially even our president has commented like this. So I think we should clear to our fraternity that yoga is add-on practice. Yoga is not the main menu of the treatment. Yoga can be, of course, the soup, yoga can be the dessert, but yoga is not the main course. So the yoga is basically add-on. Yoga cannot be a replacement therapy for the main therapy. So if the patient of obstructive airway disease does not take inhalation therapy completely and totally relying on yoga, it is not good. It is rather unfair. So the clear-cut message should be given that follow your inhalation therapy, and add on you can practice yoga, meditation, whatever it is, so that you can, maybe that you can have good quality of life, some kind of comfort, relaxation in the mind. such kind of good quality of life, some quality indicators of life, this can be improved, but provided you are taking the main course, that is the inhalation therapy, regularly and as per your expert advice. So, can we have, so this is the time 9:44, 9:43 or 9:44. So I'm really thankful to all of you. Aman, you have spared the time. Of course, that is a very precious time for a family. So of course, you have taken this time for the fraternity, for community, for our country. And I think Chess Council of India is actively involved in the upgrading and updating our chess fraternity so that we can have the chess physician of India at par with the international standards. We can say that India is now having very perfect chess physician, not only perfect clinician, but they are also perfect in the diagnosis, in the investigation approach, in the treatment approach, and overall, as far as the knowledge and skill is also concerned. So we are updating ourselves, we are upgrading ourselves on the platform of CCI, and we are much thankful to two gods. One is Krishna Bhagwan, that is the president, and second is Narayana, the Vishnu Bhagwan, the secretary. So Jai Krishna and Jai Vishnu Bhagwan. So both of you are responsible for this great show, this mega event on the platform of Chess Council of India, the Palmoclave, which you have invited, without any PowerPoint, without any presentation, a very, I would say, informal interaction. And I really salute to all of you, all the topic expert, that you have answered very precisely, very specifically, and very crystal clear to all your questions. So thank you very much for this wonderful evening. This was my first interaction in a big way on this platform, and thank you very much. Namaste. So Namaste India has become the global now. So Namaste. Thank you, Krishna. Thank you, Narayana. Yeah, Shubhankar.
Can I have comment before, because
yeah, sure. Why not?
I don't think this webinar will not be complete with some of my views on tuberculosis. I think because the data, in fact, the modeling study has shown, because of the COVID lockdown, you know how much the notification has gone. 1.8 lakh cases have not been notified. So in these 3 months of lockdown, I think in tuberculosis program is completely deranged, out of the wheel, and we are going almost 5 years back, and the mortality is going to be more than 6.4 million deaths. New cases are going to add. So that is why I think all the healthcare providers should come to change their mindset. The TB is more important. That the COVID, there is no treatment, so you should come out of that COVID drought. And
I think Shubhankar, you are 100% right. COVID is taking death 30 per day. TB is taking death toll of 1,000 deaths per day. So this is the difference between TB deaths
not
and
only
COVID.
that, if you are not
30 deaths per day, and there is the 1,000 deaths per day. And more so, yesterday we celebrated the World No Tobacco Day, and tobacco is responsible 3,000 deaths per day in India. So we are more concerned about 30 deaths per day due to COVID. We are not concerned with the 1,000 deaths due to tuberculosis. We are not concerned with the 3,000 deaths due to tobacco. And that is the reality. But we have to think of, we are not the policy maker. Yes, but we can speak, we can present, and we can advocate all these data to the policymakers. And we will continue. For last 2 years, I'm writing Prime Minister directly to ban tobacco. And yesterday also, I wrote a letter to the Prime Minister, ban tobacco and save the lives. So we will keep doing this. I think Chess Council India will come in a big way to create the academic pressure to the policymakers, before the government, before the politician, before the bureaucracy. I think that they will come, then they will hear to us. Don't wait. I'm very optimistic that they will come and we will win. Thank you.
Dr. Suryakant, just one comment.
Yeah.
Thank you very much to you, because I was really wondering how you are able to cover these 6 big topics in chess medicine. And I feel anybody who is a postgraduate student, we will be able to pass his exams, because each and every topic and the way you have handled the questions is really amazing. Thank you very much, and thank you Dr. Krishna, Dr. Narayana, and all panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I also thank my brother Krishna because the person who can't say no. I think maybe online, I don't know, because he called me and so I can't say no. That is a good initiative taken by Krishna.
I'd like to thank Dr. Krishna and Dr. Narayana for the opportunity, and I would like to congratulate Dr. Suryakant on the way he has moderated this. So alive. Namaste, sir.
Namaste.
Congratulations, Dr. Suryakant. It was a
Congratulations,
phenomenal
sir.
thing. Congratulations, sir.
It was fantastic, sir.
Congratulations to Dr. Krishna and
Congratulations
Dr.
to all
Narayan.
of you and
Yeah.
all